This is our Changing State Vote 2024. I'm Matthew Peddie, the host of Florida Matters and the host of this podcast. How do you feel about marijuana? Well, if you're voting in this election in November, you'll get a chance to have a say because there is an amendment on the ballot which will allow you to decide whether adults 21 and over are allowed to use recreational marijuana. To help explain the amendment, Amendment 3, and what it could mean for you and what supporters and opponents are saying about it, here's WUSF's Sky Lebron. Sky, thanks for being here.
Of course, thanks for having me.
So what exactly will this amendment do if Florida voters approve it?
Well, I think first it's important to talk about what is currently allowed in the state already. Marijuana right now is allowed for consumption medically, not recreationally. So right now, if you want to buy weed in the state, you either have to get approval from a licensed doctor, then you could go to a local medical dispensary once you're approved, or you can buy it illegally, as a ton of people across the state still do every single day. That's just the real situation that we're in. This amendment would change that. It would allow anyone over the age of 21, they could go into a dispensary, they can buy whatever cannabis products they want. They don't need to have any type of medical approval. And if passed, Florida would join 24 other states in doing so. That's already nearly half of the United States that allow recreational marijuana. It also sets the limits for how much a person can carry on them. So prior to this amendment potentially passing, as currently stands, if you have over 20 grams of marijuana, then you face a third-degree felony, and you get caught with that. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if it's 20 grams or 20 pounds, you're still facing that third-degree felony. This would change that to be 3 ounces, which it doesn't sound like a lot if you're talking about water, but if you're talking about marijuana, that is a hefty amount of marijuana. And then lastly, it also says in the ballot who's allowed to sell marijuana. They say medical marijuana treatment centers and other state-licensed facilities are allowed to cultivate and distribute the product. So it's not like as soon as it's legalized, your street dealer is able to sell you something legally. That's not how it would work.
So what does this mean then for people who cultivate and sell it already?
They would still have the same processes. I don't know if they would be immediately grandfathered in on the recreational side, but people that have medical facilities are still going to be able to produce and distribute, and then it's going to be up to the state to kind of ramp up those operations.
All right, so the amendment itself, how many votes does it need to pass?
Amendment 3, like all the other amendments, needs 60% of the vote to pass for recreational marijuana to be available in the state. That would be the supermajority. And that's a pretty high bar to reach when you consider how other states have voted on this issue. It's usually been around 58% from the other states that have passed recreational marijuana. That's a pretty high mark, but it still wouldn't be enough to pass that 60% threshold.
So the ballot initiative has some financial impact statement too. What does that say?
Yeah, there is that financial impact statement. It claims that legalizing weed would recreationally would bring about $200 million in state and local taxes across the entire state. And from 20 plus other examples of other states doing the same exact thing, yeah, it's obvious that making weed recreational across the state is going to infuse the state with at least some dollars. It's hard to figure out that exact amount of how it's going to help because there's a ramp-up cost, like we just mentioned, where you have to get the ball moving, you have to set regulations. All of those things cost money, so that might offset some of that initial benefit. Also, from studies that were conducted before, the states that first implemented recreational marijuana were the ones that saw that highest mark of state and local taxes. Now that we're going to across the United States, about 24 states already have that implemented, we might not see that same jump as other states.
So this is a pretty big effort to get this on the ballot even. Who's backing the amendment?
Yeah, so Smart and Safe Florida has been the main leader of that campaign. There are some other voices, other groups that are supporting the cause, but this group has been heading the charge. They've reported over $60 million in support for their campaign. Important to note that the bulk of that money has come from Trulieve, which has already had a medical presence in the state. They're a cannabis company that's already given $55 million to Smart and Safe Florida, and that accounts for a large amount of their campaign.
And I want to talk a little bit about that too, Sky, because Smart and Safe Florida, as you say, the advocacy group that worked to get the initiative on the ballot, they say this is going to help the economy and it's also going to ease pressure on the criminal justice system. For a start, what is the economic argument for legalizing recreational marijuana?
Yeah, once again, it's the taxes. It's what you could generate. There's so much sales taxes generated from recreational marijuana because many, not all, of the sales that go on across the state are currently illegal. There was a recent study that was conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. This was just released this year. The study showed that post-legalization in other states, state income increased by about 3%. And the housing prices of states that went recreational went up by about 6%. It also did note that the states that legalized earlier, once again, saw the most gains. And there's been arguments for more job access and job opportunities, but that's been disputed in other studies. So there is a lot of different pockets where there could be revenue generated, and there's still some question marks on how valid that is.
Sky, medical marijuana companies are putting a lot of money into this initiative. I mean, you mentioned TruLeave, which has put tens of millions of dollars into getting this thing on the ballot. So what does that tell you about what medical marijuana companies, this infrastructure already in Florida, stands to gain if this amendment is approved by voters?
I think it's pretty clear that companies are seeing the potential. We've seen similar campaigns in other states that ultimately passed recreational marijuana. Think about this. If it were legalized, then anybody over the age of 21 becomes a customer. That is a ton of people across the state. Florida being one of the most populated states in the United States helps that even more, makes it a prime target. And as a state that thrives on tourism, well, if you're coming into the state for a vacation, why not buy some weed or another cannabis product while you're here and you're living in a state where it's not allowed? So there's so many different opportunities, and I think companies are seeing that and seeing Florida as potentially years down the road, one of the top players for recreational marijuana.
Now, there's pushback to that, obviously, and we've heard the governor warning of stinky streets if recreational marijuana is legalized in Florida. What are some of the other arguments we're hearing against it?
And that pushback is old. I mean, that pushback's been happening, and it will continue to happen. Even to get this on the ballot, there was a challenge done by Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody. Ultimately, she lost that challenge, and the Florida Supreme Court said that it's valid ballot language. And now we're hearing the other rhetoric. DeSantis has definitely made that a major talking point, the smell of marijuana and how all the streets are going to smell. Definitely going on the most immediate impact that we could potentially see across the state. Marijuana has a strong scent. Some people don't really like it, but also for a fact, many people who travel to states that have recreational marijuana, it's a fact that not every single street smells like weed. It's also dependent on where people are allowed to smoke that weed, and that'll be up to the Florida legislature to regulate. We've seen the same thing for smoking cigarettes, and it's safe to say that we're going to see something similar for marijuana.
Which is interesting because you talk about tourism being kind of something that could benefit from legalizing recreational marijuana, but you're also seeing opponents of it say, this is not the image of Florida we want to promote. This is a family-friendly state. Do we really want people, sparking up as soon as they set foot in Florida? Is that really the image we want to project? Yeah,
so that's some of the other points that have been made in arguments against Amendment 3. There's a group called Vote No on Initiative 3. They're a group supported by the governor, and they bring up safety and access as a concern. More marijuana availability means that there's more opportunities for kids to potentially have marijuana, and studies have been conducted that show that kids should not have access to marijuana at all. Also, safety on the streets has been another thing that's really been a talking point. A report from the National Institute of Health has shown that accidents have increased in states that want recreational, so that's definitely something to consider when you go to the polls.
The other thing I've heard from opponents is that the marijuana strains that are around now, this is not your parents' marijuana, right? It's in some cases a lot stronger, so that kind of speaks to that perception that it's riskier, especially for younger folks if they're exposed to it.
Yeah, I mean, that percentages, and this is all now become much more scientific when you go into these shops. So if you want to get higher percentages, you're going to have access to that. And we've also seen from the Florida State Legislature trying to regulate what some of those percentages look like. But it only takes one bad experience for a child before something can go wrong.
Coming back to the criminal justice element, here's another argument we've heard from supporters of the amendment that if you legalize recreational marijuana, it instantly will take some pressure off law enforcement. You mentioned the amounts that you could be prosecuted for if this amendment were to pass. That will be a big difference from what happens now. So talk us through that.
Yeah, so one thing that's important to note is that it won't work retroactively. So people who were previously arrested for marijuana possession charges won't magically get out of jail all of a sudden. It'll definitely mean less arrests overall for possession of small amounts of marijuana. A recent study, this was conducted by another institute, and it was brought up by the Tampa Bay Times. There is roughly 66,000 arrests per year in Florida for marijuana charges. Some analysis shows that alone would cost, on the low end, about $12 million to just get through those arrests. So there started to be more of an effort to issue citations instead of arrests, and that's just because of recent changes in state law, but there's definitely still arrests that are happening. And historically, this, if passed, will impact minorities even more. There's been a ton of studies that show that people of color are far more likely to be arrested for possession of pot than white counterparts.
If the amendment passes, will it make a difference to those Floridians who already have a medical marijuana card?
I don't think it would change it. It would just make it easier for them, too. They don't have to have their card in their possession if they just want to go to a store really quick and buy something anywhere across the state.
So obviously voters have to decide whether this is something they want or not and vote accordingly in November. If the amendment goes through, what happens next?
So if the measure passes, first thing it's going to see, I'm sure, is going to be some pushback from the legislature and potentially some more legal challenges. Even when medical marijuana was passed in 2016 in the state, it still took about 2 years for things to be implemented across Florida, and there's been pushback on the products ever since at the legislative level. Then there's going to be regulation from the legislature. That is automatically going to happen. So companies planning to sell and cultivate weed will need to wait and see about how that regulation is going to look in their state, and they could take it from there. It probably is going to take a couple years to ramp up the operations recreationally in Florida.
WUSF's Sky Lebron, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Matt.
I'm Matthew Peddie, and this is our Changing State Vote 2024. Our Changing State is a production of WUSF. Our executive producer is Gracyn Doctor. Scott Wachtler produces the podcast. Videos by Warren Buchholz and Chandler Balkcom, who also does our graphics. Engineering support from Blake Bass. Jackson Harpe composed our theme music. I'm Matthew Peddie. Thanks for listening.